Mhm.
Because yeah, because we're all reeling under the impact of Trump saving the world.
Yeah, I mean, at the end, let's have a conversation or some preliminary conversation about that because things are beginning to, develop. They're still in process of transformation and change.
Yeah. Okay.
Um,
It's all yours then,
yeah,
Francisco.
sure. The main problem that Cuba faces historically, which I think is part of the part of the explanation to understand why they have so many difficulties, was that the Cuban economy for about 35 years after the Cuban Revolution had an excellent relationship with the USSR, which was extremely progressive, but also extremely strong on solidarity. Given that the Cuban Revolution was 90 miles away from the United States, without that connection, it's very unlikely that the Cuban Revolution would have survived. So Fidel and the leadership of the Cuban Revolution made the right choice. They said, right, we need to have allies, and that one is the most reliable one we can have. And that meant the following, that over a period of something like 35, 40 years, the Soviets were giving Cuba, on average, an equivalent of 12 million tons of oil a year. In order for Cuba to run, to run the economy, that was the energy. Cuba is very poor it hasn't got big rivers and hasn't got resources itself, energy resources. So that was fantastic. And the Cuban economy to be able to run needs only 9 million. And the Cubans got that at 20% of the world market price. That is to say, 1/5. And the 3 million extra that the Cubans got, which they refined, they sold it in the world market at the actual market price. So this is a double possible whammy. Imagine if you maintain that relationship for this long with a very well-endowed country such as the Soviet Union, you're bound to benefit massively. That's number one. The second thing is that Cuba specialized, well, it was already specialized in the production of sugar. Cuba produced every year something in the region of 7 to 8 million tons of sugar. The United States did everything to block. The main market of Cuban sugar was the United States, of course. And the United States blocked it immediately after the revolution took place. So the Soviets stepped in again with the socialist camp at the time. And I remember looking at the figures in 1986, 1985. And at the time, the price of sugar, the world market price of sugar, of the pound of sugar, was 7 cents of a dollar. But the Soviets paid Cuba 40 cents. So that is to say, there was a subsidy. The Cubans don't like this to be called subsidy, but it was a sort of extra money to the tune of 33 cents for every pound of sugar, and the Soviets consumed just about all the 7 million. So imagine you get massive support with your energy bill, and then a massive support with your exports, and then plus all the technological transfer and so on that were taking place. And whereas in any other country, the elite would have used that for their own enrichment, of course they would have. In the case of Cuba, Cuba built the most powerful, extraordinary big welfare state, one of the best in the world. Cuba was able, as a consequence of that, not only to have free healthcare, free education. When it comes to transport, people pay symbolically nothing. A flat rate for telephone, electricity was nearly free. So it was a very good deal. And the Cuban population developed and got educated to incredible levels. It's one of the most educated countries on earth. The level of scholarity is 98, 99%. They build so many universities, the capacity, I mean, the technical, professional stuff are essentially staffed by women, something like 70 to 75% of the technical stuff, people who work in laboratories, technicians of every kind, so are women in Cuba. And this is clearly a massive plus, because in a country such as Cuba, as in any poor country in the Caribbean, when there is social exclusion and poverty, women are the ones that actually suffer the most. And women were the worst treated. And the level of prostitution in 1959, when Fidel arrived, was just huge, gigantic, because Americans came and used Cuba as a sort of big casino. So one speaker in one of the Cuba Solidarity campaign James made a fantastic point, and he said this, which was absolutely right, and I think encapsulates what I'm trying to say. He said, only in Cuba, the daughter of a sugar cane cutter can and will become a doctor, a medical doctor, only in Cuba, nowhere else in the world. And if you actually were to consult, many of the doctors that became trained at the very beginning, many of them came from parents that were from very poor background. So what I'm trying to say with all of this is it was a sort of laxity in the Cuban system of rule because they worked more or less on the basis of an infinite budget because they had this connection with the socialist camp. And Fidel made a very good point when the Soviet Union collapsed. He was interviewed on Channel 4, well, at least it was shown on Channel 4, not interviewed by Channel 4. It was a documentary where he was interviewed. And I said, well, you're going through tremendous troubles now that the socialist camp has fallen, the Soviet Union is gone. And, do you think you've made any mistake? And Fidel said, no, absolutely not. If we were to go through the same thing, we'll do exactly what we have done. And then he sat back, and then he waited. So for a couple of seconds, he said, we should have predicted that the Soviet Union could have collapsed. We never thought of that. And then he said, the idea, 5 years before the collapse of the Soviet Union, the idea that the Soviet Union was going to disappear was like thinking that the sun will never come up again, but it did.
Yeah. Yeah.
So suddenly they find themselves that the economy, because of this laxity, these extra resources, which went to the Cuban economy for so long, then it produced an economy which, broadly speaking, was not very productive. It was productive. It doesn't mean to say you cannot make Cubans work hard because, they take it easy, sort of relax. They don't suffer the pressure of capitalist exploitation. So they take it, it's rather gentle. And by the time with the Soviet Union collapsed, Cuba lost huge. I don't want to give you all the figures, but I can if you want to. But when I remember we visited Cuba in 1993, which was the worst year after the collapse of the USSR, and the Cubans called that year Armageddon, which gives you an idea of how bad it was. And we met the Minister of Economics, Jose Luis Rodriguez, and he said, he gave the figures, I'm an economist, and when he was giving the figures of, the decline, I thought, Jesus Christ, this is going to fall tomorrow. And then he ended up with all the figures, which were, horrific. And then he said, very well, he said, I'll never forget, that when a country goes down economically, there is a point when no matter what you do, you cannot recover. You are going to collapse. Then he went on to say, we think that we reached that level 3 months ago. And then he said, if you ask me why we haven't collapsed, this is my answer. He said, I do not know. So that was the state of the situation. So the beauty of the whole thing was that the Cubans very quickly, it was extraordinary quality of political leadership. In 5 years, the Cubans reinserted themselves in the world economy through tourism, which they developed magnificently. They have to make concessions to their ethical principles in some respect. Not necessarily there was a capitulation, there was a necessary adjustment because tourism by definition is small and fragmentary. If the state controls all the taxi drivers, all the taxi system, if the state controls all the hotel, if the state controls everything, you don't have efficiency. The state should participate, and they decided the state was going to participate in the tourism industry, but they allowed the private sector to start to develop. Just to give you an example, tourists at the time, I was one of those, went to places called paladar, which means pallet. And it was a house where they were allowed by a special license to actually have 12 chairs and a little restaurant, no more than 12. If you were caught having a 13th chair, the fine would be $1,000 payable immediately. The idea was to prevent, the resurgence of a bourgeoisie that will accumulate more and more and more. And that provided an extraordinary service, good service. It was home food to the tourists. It was excellent, really fun, very good idea. So at one point, in the height of the tourism industry, expansion of tourism in Cuba, the private sector, which involved other areas, but mainly the tourism was the one that developed the most. The private sector must represent in terms of GDP something like 25, 27%, which is big compared to what Cuba was, but which means that 75% is in state hands anyway. So it's pretty safe. It was pretty safe. But it produced, well, on the one hand, provided services and goods to the tourist sector and to the tourists, but also it didn't represent the danger to the revolution as such. And the Cubans were very smart and they allowed the dollar to circulate freely. I remember, paying with dollars, paying with Cuban pesos, paying with euros. All of that was clever because the state was capturing all of these resources in order to recover. So in 5 years, Cuba recovered, which is incredible, after that level of collapse. Now, then by 2018, the level of the number of tourists that Cuba was getting was in the region of 4.7 million, which is very impressive. That is to say, the driving force of the economy in Cuba by 2018, as a result of their adjustment, to actually survive, was the driving engine of the economy, was tourism. And the state participated very heavily in joint ventures with multinational companies, with Melia and chain of hotels and so on. And it was really, really good. Cuba was brilliant. 4.7 million was really high. And they were calculating that if they could expand to 10 million, then they wouldn't have to worry about anything. 10 million tourists for a Cuban economy that has a population of 11 million is not much. It may sound like a lot, but it's not. Just to give you an example, Spain has 47 million inhabitants and every year receives more than 80 million tourists. So, and it doesn't, there's no crisis. Well, now there is, because things are getting out of hand. But normally it was 75, 77, 78, 80 million, 81 million, 82 million. So the potential for the expansion of tourism of Cuba, which is the most beautiful island in the Caribbean and the biggest, it's got the best beaches. I have to pronounce very correctly that one. Otherwise, people get the wrong idea. It's got, absolutely wonderful landscapes. It's got good music. It's got better rum, you name it, the best music and so on. So it's very attractive. To get 10 million, even 20 million would be totally possible. And that would have resolved all the problems of the scarcity that Cuba suffered from, which is doesn't have energy, it doesn't have a huge amount of resources, it doesn't produce much except coffee, rum, and a few other things. So tourism was ideal. But then there was COVID in 2019. And as a consequence of COVID, but it wasn't only COVID, it was COVID plus Donald Trump. They realized the weakness of the Cuban economy as a consequence of the negative effects of COVID on tourism, that they could squeeze the Cuban economy quite dramatically. And the Cuban economy from 2018 to 2020 went down from 4.7 million to 1.6 million. And I think it was worse than that, actually. These are official figures. My understanding was that the tourists arriving to Cuba fell by 94%. That is to say, catastrophic. And of course, it's like the Soviet Union collapsing, Who would have imagined that there was going to be a pandemic, a COVID pandemic, that was going to hit the sector? So, and ever since the United States has been, imposing sanctions and coercive measures and blocking it and intensifying the blockade more and more and more and more, to the point of what we, possibly some of you saw our, resolutions at the AGM of the Cuba campaign, which is they're taking every possible measure to ensure that Cuba collapses. Collapses in the following sense, not necessarily as a result of economic asphyxiation, which they are trying as well, but as a result of driving people in Cuba to despair so that they rise up. And then they will come in. That has been a calculation all the time. And I think the strategies of the United States are drawing the conclusion that for the first time in 60-something years, they have the possibility, something they've been dreaming on for 60 years, which is to build a mass opposition to communism in Cuba, which they have done in other places.
Francisco, can I just interrupt a second? We've got just over 4 minutes left. So will you be able to come back in for another half an hour?
This is just a preliminary, so yes, of course.
Okay. So if we could all switch off in a minute and then come back in with the same.
Well, you, Chair, tell me when to stop, and then I'll stop and wait for the. Can we use the same link, or do we have to wait for another link?
Sorry?
Can we use the same link? Or do we have to
use the same link. Yeah, we use the same link. We just leave the meeting and then put the same link in and come back in.
So let me finish with this and then we'll switch off. The United States, for 4 years, prepared the ground, the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID prepared the ground. They spent more than 40 million in something like 3 to 4 years. They prepared NGOs, organizations of every kind. They funded, subversion and so on. And on the 21st of July, 2021, there was a social explosion. And the calculation was to try to do something similar to what they've done in Nicaragua in 2018, and something similar they've done in Venezuela in 2017, as well as in 2014 and 2017, which was street violence organized by these people, paid by them, funded by the United States. And in the case of Venezuela in 2014 and 17, each one of these subversions lasted 6 months. In Nicaragua, it lasted about 5 months, but in Cuba, it lasted 1 day. So that failed, thankfully. And then from there on, Cuba had to adjust to the new set of aggression which had been sent against them, inflicted on them, which is what we're going to discuss in the second part.
Thank you very much, Francisco. So I'll stop the recording now and we'll all leave and then come back in again on the same,
We'll do it.
same
Same link.
codes. Thank you.